I'm an artist. I did a broadcast, I think it was the day before yesterday, a live broadcast where I talked about starting a fine art watercolor sketch. And today I'm going to show you, actually the sketch that I started in that broadcast is now finished. I'll show you that in a moment. And a big part of that broadcast, if you are interested, a big part of that broadcast, I was teaching about what I call the three contrasting or oppositional elements of good visual art. This is not something I learned somewhere. This is something I learned over 60 years of being an artist. I am not 60 years old. I'm a good bit older than that. And those three elements are realism. I like the word similitude. It's a little more precise and accurate. Similitude, the abstract and or primitive elements of design. Line, shape, color, design, value, texture. Line, shape, color, design, value, texture. Line, shape, color, design or composition, value, texture. Those are the six. No, there are not seven. I talked about that in the last video. The six elements of design. And then the third oppositional aspect is a history of human movement. And if you wonder what in the world I mean by that, I'm not going to repeat it here. Go back, please, and watch the last video. So let's talk for just a moment. Well, not a moment. Let me show you the finished piece that I was working on in the last broadcast. It's nice to be able to come back and show you what a finished piece looks like. And because it's finished, I can now point out some things that might help make a little bit of sense. For instance, I'll go back to my face for just a minute. Line, shape, color, design, value, texture. There's a reason I keep repeating that is because I want you to repeat it. Line, shape, color, design, value, texture. It becomes like a little poem that's in your head. Line, shape, color, design, value, texture. Line, shape, color, design, value, texture. I'm hoping this is getting in your head the way it's getting in mine. And the objective, which of each of those elements, is to make each element interesting or interesting, depending which part of the English-speaking world you're coming from. So I want interesting lines, line, shape, color. I want interesting shapes, and I talked about this a good bit. So let me zero in on the interesting color. If you are new to my channel and you were paying attention, you should have been asking, what does interesting color mean? And then I added one more word to interesting as it interacts with the seven primitive, seven abstract elements. The other word was variety. So variety and interestingness. All right, so I want to show you in my finished piece a few examples. Let's start out with interesting color. I'm going to get as close as I can. I hope that I'm not going out of focus here. I'm afraid I am a little bit. All right. So do you see? Now this is part of the joy, the delight of using watercolor pencils in my under sketches. Do you see those purplish, reddish purple lines? Now they've melted so much. You see these? There's little bits of blue and purple. Where else should I go? Oh, I have branches here, some of which are blue. Isn't that interesting? And then up here, some of these branches are purple. Up here in the sky, there's a blush, if I may call it that, of yellow. Why? Because the first colored watercolor pencil that I used to do a sketch with was yellow. Those of you who understand watercolor pencils, when you apply water to them, they blossom, they grow, they bleed, they turn into watercolors. So there's a yellow tinge up here There's also a yellow tinge along the top of this roof. And now here's, let me go back to my face for a minute. What I want you to understand, and this, I explained this again in the last video, but now maybe you have something concrete to connect it to. The existence of purple and blue lines in the brick face of a house is not realism. That's anti-realism. Do you understand? If I wanted this house to be more realistic, I would certainly not introduce weird colors like blue and purple into what is clearly a brick wall, because purple and blue do not naturally exist in a brick wall. Likewise, in a blue sky, and don't confuse this with like, well, sometimes the sky is kind of yellow. No, 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 no. No, that's a different issue. You're thinking like a realist. I am thinking like an anti-realist. And this is what I said in my last broadcast. I'm repeating myself, but I'm fleshing it out a little bit. These issues, these elements are against each other. There is similitude, realism, and then fighting against, warring against, violent, rah, rah, we hate realism, rah, are the elements of design. Likewise, the history of human movement, which you can see defined in my last video, I won't repeat it here, is against realism. The elements of design and history of human movement, both of which are dreadfully important in visual art. In fact, as you heard me say last broadcast, they are actually more important than similitude. Let me give you an example, and I could pull it up. Maybe I'll put it in. Maybe I'll put a link in the description. Maybe. I was in Amsterdam a couple years ago. Who wasn't, right? Right, I know. And in Amsterdam is a museum, an art museum called the Rijksmuseum. It is the Rembrandt Museum with a whole bunch of other stuff. But believe me, it's Rembrandt's museum with special guests invited. Right across the street from that, by the way, is the Van Gogh Museum. And next time I go back to Amsterdam, I'm going to that one. Rijksmuseum. The most famous, kind of like in the Louvre, the most famous painting in the Louvre in Paris is the Mona Lisa. The most famous painting by far in the Rijksmuseum is Rembrandt's Night Watch. That's the traditional, the sortie of Captain Banningcock's militia, if you want a better title, but we don't care about that. It's known mostly as Night Watch, partly because it had such a dark varnish over it that everybody thought it was a night scene. Then they cleaned it up and found out it was not a nighttime scene. Anyway, I digress. You can Google it while I'm talking. Rembrandt Night Watch. Do it on whatever, when you're done. Most famous painting by far, by orders of magnitude, in that museum. In the same room, there's a whole bunch of rooms, big rooms in this museum, right? And the Rembrandt's Night Watch is, I'm guessing it's about 8 or 10 feet tall and 12 or 15 feet wide, something like that. I don't remember, but it's big. It's a big painting. In the same room is a painting about 3 times that large, and I forget the name of it. I've looked it up and I've used it in my teaching. It's like 24 feet wide and 12 feet high, is another famous painting, Dutch, from the same, roughly the same era. And as far as realism goes, it puts Rembrandt's Night Watch to shame. It is so realistic, and I do realism on occasion. It is absolutely breathtaking. When you're standing there in front of it, like 3 feet in front of it, there's a man wearing armor. Say there's a whole bunch of people. You swear you could walk up and tap on that armor and it would go clang, clang, clang. It is that real. There's people wearing furs, and it looks like you could walk up and brush the fur and it would feel like fur. You get the point. Hyper realism. Bigger than Rembrandt's, way more realistic than Rembrandt's, but people travel around the world and and go to the Rijksmuseum not to see that painting. In fact, it's not even uber famous. It's just there. In that room, on any given moment, there's 15, 20 people gathered around Rembrandt's Night Watch, and there's 2 people in front of the other one. I was one of those 2 because I'm a weird artist. Why? Because the other painting is realism to the nth degree, and truly breathtaking, truly amazing, and worth looking at. Because realism is one of the 3 things that human beings like to see in their artwork. But why is the crowd not gathered? Why do people not travel, fly to Amsterdam and see that painting? But they do to see Rembrandt's Night Watch. Why? Because Rembrandt's painting, in addition to a spectacular degree of realism, not as real as the other one, but still very realistic, has line, interesting line, shape, color, variety, line, shape, color, interesting line, interesting shape, interesting value, interesting texture, blah, 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 blah. You get the idea? And Rembrandt's painting also has amazing, breathtaking, jaw-dropping history of human movement. You can see that he took a brush and he went, and there it is. All right, so when am I going to start drawing? I don't know. Bear with me. I will. So what makes a piece of artwork good is these 3 things coming together. Let me just, here's some more interesting color in this tree up here. I think you can see that as a faint purple. I could also talk about texture. Now, the texture on this face is very intentional, so it's not very magical. I got a few bricks drawn. Maybe if I count them, I can actually count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are 10,000 bricks on this wall, and I've drawn 9 of them. And then with a tiny bit of gouache, I've highlighted some texture there. That is interesting texture right there. There's texture everywhere. There's interesting lines. Look at this. Can you see the very fine ink line that is a demarcation of a shift in the brickwork here? And yet, look at it's off here, and it's off here. And there's a little squiggly. Again, I demonstrated this very thing in my last video, so I won't repeat it ad nauseum, but I want you to be able to see how these elements look, at least in a watercolor sketch. I call this a watercolor sketch. It is not a formal watercolor. Why? Because it's got watercolor pencils, and it's got pen and ink, and it has a little bit of gouache. All those things make it not technically a watercolor. It's a watercolor sketch. All right, so I have saved just a few. This is my next drawing, and I've saved just a little bit of it so you can watch me, because in the last broadcast I didn't do any ink lines. So now I am doing ink lines. Here is the photograph that I'm working from. I'm going to put this up here in front of me where I can see it. Oh, bear with me just a minute while I try to get my live monitor going so that I can see you guys when you begin to make comments. Bear with me just a minute here. There we go. Coming up soon. Any chats? Oh, and I have to make sure I turn down the volume here. There we go. All right, no chats yet, but 3 people watching, one of whom is me. So please give me a wave or let me know who you are if you want to. All right, so back to the artwork at hand. There's my go-by, if you will. That's my photograph. And I'm going to proceed to draw. In my last video, I talked about when you're sitting down doing artwork, how easy it is to get your verticals and your horizontals, for that matter, to get them skewed. So I'm using, by the way, the antidote to that. If you have a hard time, if you finished an artwork and find your lines are this, it's because you were sitting down. If you want to fix that, most of the time, one of the easiest things you do is stand up to do your artwork. All right, but I'm not going to stand up today. I'm sitting down, so I have to use other tricks. So I'm using this ruler as a guide to make sure that my lines are vertical. And for those of you who didn't watch the video from the other day, let me explain what you're looking at. I when I'm doing, this is my technique. I didn't learn it from anybody. I made it up. It's kind of typical of being Dan Nelson. I'm always making stuff up myself, not getting it from other people. I'm what is called classically, I'm what is called an autodidact. That is, I'm a person who usually flourishes on teaching myself. Some of you are like that, and some of you are not. All right, so in the the other day's video, I begin my drawing using watercolor pencils. My first drawing was, you probably can't even see it, was in yellow. The second was in orange. The third was in lavender, light purple. So this then, yellow, orange, lavender, ink. This is what you watch me doing right now, is my fourth drawing of the subject matter. With each drawing, I try to make I edit, I make corrections, and so forth. And yeah, you can see how I am holding the pen. Not now, hang on, I'm using a ruler just for a second, just to make sure. Yeah, you see how I'm using it, what I call side saddle, either tucked under my pinky or tucked between my two middle fingers. Yeah, that language works. I had to look at my hand to see if I had two middle fingers. I'm only 71 years old. I don't really know how many fingers I have at this point in my journey. Anyway, so yes, because why am I holding my pen in this unusual grip? Forgive me, I just had a technical snafu. My battery died, so give me just a minute to see if I can get a slightly better view for you guys to watch. All right, and hang on, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. Oh, it's already zoomed in quite a bit. All right, so there you go. Not quite as good as the other view. It's a technical issue I'm going to have to work with. So I am holding my pen in this, what I call side saddle grip, because it facilitates the goal of making interesting marks or interesting lines. When you hold your pen this way, you're holding your pen or pencil or brush the same way that you held your pencil in second and third grade when you were learning how to control your fingers and write letters. So when you hold your pencil in the traditional way or brush, you are tapping into control freak, I like to say. And the control freak grip does not lend itself to making interesting marks. It is your control grip. It is not your interesting grip. So if you want a quick tip on how to start making more interesting marks, I'm giving it to you right now. Some of you are going to pay attention and say, by golly, that's a good idea. I think I'm going to start doing that. Others will give it a try and quit instantly because it doesn't feel natural. Well, of course it doesn't feel natural. What do you think? You've been struggling with your hand since you were 5 years old to make it do what you wanted. In other words, a control grip. So to switch over, it will initially feel very awkward. All right, so I am done, just finished with my ink lines. I'll put my pens away, and it is time for watercolor. Let's see if I can do this. Nope, I can't. Bear with me just a minute. Sorry, I'm jerking you around. This is my water kit. I want to keep this very far away from this. That would be a mess. All right, so this is my little watercolor tray. I say little because, of course, I do have several big, larger ones. And No real surprises here. Generally warm colors, generally cool colors. Spray bottle, blah, blah, blah. Nothing unusual, magical, nothing surprising here whatsoever. So I'm going to put this away now. I don't think you need to see that anymore. And I'm going to grab the first brush I'm going to grab. And again, here's my jug of rinse water. Surprise number one to some of you. You regulars are not surprised at all. Surprise number one, a 3-inch brush. What? Yes, so some of you should be taking note. All right, so what colors am I going to do first? Once again, let me show you the reference. Here it is. Essentially red brick house. That's what we call red brick, but it's not. It's more of it's lighter orange brick than some. Gray roof, blue sky, and green grass. By the way, in this photo, the sky in this photograph is completely supplied by Photoshop. Also in Photoshop, I pushed this tree back from, it was covering more of the house, and I pushed it back, and of course have reflected that reality in my drawing. Okay. My finger is on my lip. I had to change to this camera so you could actually see I'm not lying. So I'm deciding what colors to start out with. Okay, I think I've got it. I'm going to do the red, pale red brick house color. Then I'm going to do the blue sky color and the green color, one after another, not giving the colors any time to dry in between. Okay? So basically, 3 colors. I'm right now over here in my paint tray. I'm mixing up reddish, yellow, brown. Okay, Kleenex in one hand. Here we go. Not enough water. Fix that. There we go. Now some of you, unless you're a regular viewer, the right response at that moment was a gasp. Again, you regulars, you are not surprised. You kind of knew that was coming. If there's any newcomers watching, the appropriate response, I'm just helping you to be honest here, the appropriate response would have been, as opposed to, oh yeah, that's what I was going to do. Oh yeah, that's what I was going to do. Now, as you well know, this is not the only way to do a watercolor rendering. Of course not. I'm giving you my way. That's what you're watching for. Is you want to see my way. Hello, Gil Bates. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Now I'm picking up some blue. Oh, if I just put yellow in my blue tray, there we go. Now I have a pretty intense green, but I think that's all right. Now I do want to make sure that this doesn't run downhill and actually run off outside of my square here. All right, as I said, all right, that's good. I'm going to rinse out my brush very briefly, but I am definitely in a hurry here. I am in a hurry. Oh, sorry, I missed some of that. Had the camera pointing the wrong way, sorry. What I'm doing now is almost more important than what I was doing when I was applying the paint. Taking off the paint is probably is certainly more fussy, accurate. I'm more concerned with accuracy now than I was when I was applying the paint. I did pale reddish brown in the middle, blue at the top, and green at the bottom. And let me repeat again. This is not the normally prescribed method of doing a watercolor, right? You know that. This is the wacky Dan Nelson method of doing a watercolor sketch. I don't even call it a watercolor, strictly speaking. This is my method of doing a watercolor sketch. But I hope you can already begin to see some of the advantages of doing such a crazy approach. First of all, I've got a whole bunch of delightful colors going on here that would not have been achieved if I had been painting in a traditional controlled manner. Oops. I have a 1-inch brush now. I thought it was clean. I guess it is clean enough, I hope. So I'm lifting. I'm doing the same thing I was doing with the tissue. I'm just doing it a little more precisely now. With a 1-inch brush. Lifting out what is watercolor pigment that is still wet, so it lifts out very easily. So not only do I have interesting colors on my watercolor paper, but I have soft colors, interesting gradations. The colors of the trees and bushes and so forth blend into the colors of the house and vice versa. So interesting things are happening. I hope it's significant now. When I use a word like interesting, that word might have a little bit more import to you because of what I was talking about a little while ago. Interesting line, shape, color, design, value, and texture. So there are actually ways, many ways, to achieve interestingness. Usually called interest, but then it's confusing. So interestingness will do. Okay, it's still damp, it's still wet. Here's now a 1.5-inch brush. I'm going back into my yellow orange because I've lost most of, and you can see now I'm being more precise with these strokes than I was when I was using the great big 3-inch brush. But because everything is still damp, I'm still getting soft and subtle edges. And let me just give a quick explanation and nod to perhaps those of you who are real watercolorists. You can see that I am, and I do real watercolor sometimes, but this is a watercolor sketch. I am violating one of the most important rules, laws one might say, of watercolor painting, and that I am losing my light areas. That's a little bit too dark. I'm losing my light areas way prematurely. If you're a traditional watercolor artist, you protect the light areas with your life. right? Because you can't get them back. Now you can lift out a little bit, like you see me doing. Why? So the question is, why do I not care that much about losing my light? And that is because I am doing, again, what I call a watercolor sketch, which means I can cheat a whole bunch. Late in the process, I'm going to be using opaque gouache. I don't usually touch a watercolor with my finger. It didn't go very well, so. All right, while I've got this dark gray on my brush, I'm going to go back into my brown up here. So that's why I have the freedom to violate my whites, is because I'm going to cheat. And it's a huge cheat. Those of you who are watercolors, losing those lights, using gouache to achieve whites is a huge cheat. Like, and what I mean by that is I certainly could not ever enter one of these renderings into a watercolor competition, right? They would say, heck no, are you kidding? You used opaque medium in there. You can't do that. This is a watercolor competition. Right? I'm never going to get into Watercolor Society of America with one of these watercolor renderings. It's not going to happen. And of course, that's not my objective, so I don't care. But my objective is to create a beautiful piece of artwork. I just don't care if I accomplish that through traditional means. I am being quite rebellious. But I hope you can see that I'm going to go ahead and do some dark green now. A little bit earlier than I had expected to, but one of the primary charms that you see happening on the paper right now is the soft edges where these wet zones are bleeding. Blossoming is often the term used by watercolor artists. Very good description of what happens when you lay down two wet zones next to each other, on top of each other, overlapping with each other. They blossom. Either one blossoms into the other, or they blossom into each other. And certainly we're getting that. So I would put that phenomenon, the soft edges and the blossoming effect, generally, mostly under the interesting texture category. Again, all visual artwork is a three-legged stool, runs on three legs. The visual artwork that human beings enjoy looking at is artwork that has a high degree of similitude, but, great big but here, high degree of similitude, but that similitude moderated significantly by interesting shape, line, shape, color, design, value, texture. Line, shape, color, design, value, texture. Line, shape, color, design, value, texture. right? So the soft edges, the bleeding effect that I'm achieving by working wet and wet and wet with these great big brushes, I would put mostly in the texture category. I'm creating interesting texture. Now I'm not done, of course. Don't panic yet. Don't say, "Oh, that looks awful." I doubt that that's what you're saying, but you certainly could say, "It doesn't look very realistic." In which case, you're tapping into the right issue. Why? Because interesting line, shape, color, design, value, texture, and interesting history of human movement are opposed to each other. They do not go together. The history of human movement and the interesting elements of design are at war with each other. They are opposed to each other. That is very important to understand. They don't go together, they go apart. And as I've said, I'll say one more time, that as important as the elements, as important as realism is, and I do consider it very important, it's not as important as the elements of design or the history of human movement. They're even more important. I'm switching now to, I'm rinsing out my 1-inch brush. And again, I'm going to lift out. And at this point, I'm not doing anything that all of you watercolor artists, you can identify with this part, the lifting out, the playing with fluid dynamics, right? That's the whole art of the whole art of being a watercolor painter is playing with the science of fluid dynamics, the way liquids flow. That's what you're wrestling with the entire time you're doing a watercolor painting. You're trying to make the paint, the water flow, and it's a wrestling match between what the paint does all by itself and what you force it to do in order to achieve a degree of similitude. All right? So it is always that way. I hope that's making sense. The reason I'm harping on this is because it's a subject that is not often understood as much as it should be. The subject that the elements of design are at war with realism and vice versa. So it's always a delicate balancing act between realism and interesting lines, interesting shapes, interesting colors, line, shape, color, interesting composition, interesting values, and interesting texture. Line, shape, color, design, value, texture. Line, shape, color, design, value, texture. Now, I said the other day in my last live broadcast, I have a moment to repeat it here. There is some confusion in the minds of some art teachers. I'm going to rectify that again right now. Some people, some art teachers, they add one more word to the elements of design. And I contend they do that because of a profound misunderstanding. They add the word form. Line, shape, color, design, values, texture, and form. So then they say there are 7 elements of design. What they mean by form is realism. If it's a cow, it should look like a cow. That's my universal realism motif, is a cow. If it's supposed to be a cow, it should look like a cow. They call that form, and they add that to the elements of design. Well, I hope you if you've listened to me thus far, you can understand the confusion. Because, and I understand how they got there, because they look at the elements of design, and then they scratch their head and say, but wait a minute, what about realism? What about similitude? What about a picture? Isn't that an element of design? They say, yeah, it should be in there somewhere. So then they add one. Here's what they don't understand, this fundamental principle that the elements of design are in opposition to realism. So the elements of design do not include one element that is called realism. No. That's, again, profound misunderstanding. Realism is opposed to the abstract elements of design. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Then everything falls in place. You go, oh, now it makes sense. I get it. When you are doing realism, you are anti-doing elements of design. When you are doing elements of design, you are undoing realism. Okay, come to grips with that. That is the way it works. And once that's clear, oh, everything becomes clear. Oh, I get it. So yes, you can paint the cow with a little two-haired brush, and every hair, every eyelash, every sparkle of reflection is perfect. But if you do that, you get virtually no history of human movement. And I explained that in the last video. I'm not going to repeat it here. And that's okay. As you well know, you might be one of those artists and I have dear friends who do hyper realism. And I occasionally do go to dannelsonart.com and look at two things. One, my wedding painter portraits, the bride and groom. Not everybody else in the crowd is somewhat abstracted, but the bride and groom in my wedding paintings of the last 8 or 9 years or so have been quite realistic. Also look at my automotive paintings. And then I have a still life. Ironically, I was accepted into Oil Painters of America a couple years ago with a super realistic still life, which is kind of funny, kind of fun, because I got into OPA, the national show, with a style of artwork that is not what I usually do. So that was a little bit of a personal victory or coup. I got in with my left hand, so to speak. Anyway, so I do realism because it's fun. Here's the big thing, and I say this always very cautiously because, again, I have dear friends, some of whom are much more famous than I am and have won many more national and international competitions than I have. I have won precisely 0 international competitions, by the way. But I have friends who have, and they do what can only be described as hyper-realism. And I do not discredit them. I do not disparage hyper-realism. I do it sometimes for fun. But I do teach an understanding of art in which what really makes most human beings look at a canvas or a paper, if it's a watercolor, the most is this interplay between realism, comma, history of human movement, comma, and the elements of design. All right, and I know I'm beating that horse to death. It's because somebody out there needs to hear me beat it a little more. So soon as you get it, I can stop talking about it. I'm being silly, of course. I am driven by a desire to help people, my fellow artists, understand the art world and what they are actually doing when they're creating art. understanding helps. By the way, I discovered, just to help explain that in the way I teach, I discovered several years ago that there are many art teachers, and they're good. They're good art. There are many art teachers who teach how to do things, how to paint a winter landscape. A little bit. I mean, Bob Ross did this. He's not the only one, but they teach you how to paint a yellow daisy in a red bowl, right? They teach how. And I discovered, oh, you know what? I don't do much of that. A little bit, not much. Because instead, my calling in the cosmos is not to teach you how to paint, but to teach you to gain understanding, a deeper level. Forgive me, that sounds prejudicial. Nevertheless, the word escaped my mouth, so I'll stick with it. A deeper level of understanding. So I'm not teaching skill, I'm teaching, if you grasp the principles, you can paint any way you want to. Whereas if I teach you how to paint a cardinal in the snow, you will know how to paint a cardinal in the snow. But you may not understand why human beings, I'll put it this way, you may not, if you learn how to do that, you may not be understanding why your cardinal in the snow looks better, or somebody else's cardinal in the snow looks better than yours, or vice versa. And that's what I want to teach, is, again, what I call an understanding level. So that's why I'm harping on these things. If you can understand the interplay between realism, history of human movement, and elements of design, then you can go forth and paint any way you want to. Now, there are a lot of other things to understand in painting, of course, but I do take that dynamic to be absolutely fundamental. All right, so you've been watching me paint for a good while here. I'm not going to continue to broadcast throughout the entire. This will probably take me another hour, perhaps, is my guess. But I do hope that you can see, let me pick this up so you can maybe see a little bit closer. I hope you can see some of the charm that is beginning to appear on the paper. The charm is largely related not to how realistic the painting is. In fact, another way to describe this, my technique, what I call watercolor sketches, another way to describe that is that I achieve a high degree of similitude with lines, the ink lines, and then I achieve a high degree of abstraction with the watercolor. And if you go to my website, dannelsonart.com, and click on the watercolor album, I don't know how many, I have 30 or 40 watercolor paintings there, you will be able to pick out some of the watercolor paintings where I, in fact, take that principle to a whole nother level beyond what I'm doing here. That is to say, the pen and ink is rigid, fairly accurate, although again, not perfectly rigid, because I talked the other day about interesting lines and what that means. So, but on my website, I have examples of paintings where I take the realism, if you will, to a whole nother level of pen and ink. No, what I should be saying, I take the abstraction of the watercolor quite a bit beyond what I'm doing here right now. So again, if you're interested, if you want to school yourself a little bit and see more of this work, I do also have a handful of traditional watercolors. Sorry, I was stuck thinking. Yeah, before I go, I guess I'll do a little bit more. Again, here's the photograph. So one of the main elements that is still not is the dark shutters and the color inside the windows. Now, I don't like window is catching a ton of reflection and it's pure white. So that would be a mistake to copy that. But in all these other windows, they're Venetian blinds inside the house. And I go, hello, Artist Ross. Thank you. Good to hear from you. So I'll do a little bit of that before I go. I'm mixing up a pale green. And once again, if I'm painting this with a broad brush, solid pale green, and you do this, by the way, don't you, you watercolor painters? That window there, I want it pale green, but it's a little too dark. There, I was just right. And I'm going to add some, this is turning out to be, I wanted a little bit more bluish green, a little more blue in that. If I'm painting these windows with such a broad brush, and yet the mullions, you know what mullions are, right? You do, don't you? The mullions are the white boards that create the tic-tac-toe shape in traditional windows. Those boards are called mullions. Okay, the mullions in this house are all white. And yet here I am obliterating the mullions with my pale green paint. Now, if this were a traditional watercolor painting, I could, if it was traditional, the ink lines wouldn't be there, of course. But let's pretend for a moment that instead of ink lines, there would be faint pencil lines, graphite pencil lines there, right? If I wanted this to be a traditional, then I could still paint the windows with a broad brush, and then I would have to take probably an X-Acto knife and scratch. And again, all you watercolor painters, you know that. You're familiar with those tricks. You know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But because I am doing a watercolor sketch, I give myself the great freedom to come back with white gouache and a very fine brush and capture those white mullions. Now here's something that I have talked about this at great length in my oil painting videos, and it applies here as well. It applies to any kind of visual artwork. Anytime you have a oft repeated motif, that means a shape or an object or something that appears over and over and over again in your painting. And indeed, the mullions in these windows would fit exactly into that description. What I'm saying is there are a lot of mullions in this painting, right? So here's a rule for you. It goes under the rubric of variety. Anytime you have a oft repeating pattern, like mullions, it behooves you. If you want to be behooven, if you want to be behooved, it behooves you to render the oft repeating pattern in a variety of techniques. In other words, like a minute ago, I talked about, because this is a watercolor sketch, I have the freedom to pick up a nice, very fine Winsor Newton Series 7 brush with white gouache and go, and of course, when I do that, I'm going to be very mindful of creating interesting marks, right? I'm not just going to go, and paint them all like I'm a house painter. No, not at all. I'm going to be very mindful that these marks need to be interesting. Anyway, but if I paint them all that way, it'll be a missed opportunity and the painting won't be as good. So I'm going to employ the other thing I just mentioned, which is whenever there's a whole bunch of something in your painting, you invent some secondary or alternative trick for rendering that thing. So in fact, I can tell you right now that when it comes time for me to render these mullions, I'm not going to do them all the same. Some of them I'm going to paint with a tiny brush in white gouache. Others of them I am almost certainly going to use an X-Acto knife and scratch them out. Some of you might be saying, well, why do you have to do that? Well, first of all, you don't have to do anything. And you are more than welcome to create a painting that people don't enjoy very much. There's a snarky bit of humor. You're more than welcome to do a bad painting. But if you're watching me, I am explaining to you at an understanding level how to create a beautiful painting. And the elements of design and what you do with the elements of design, one of the fundamental words is variety. So just based on that rubric, that simple concept alone, that one concept should tell you that when you have to do 87.5 mullions in this painting, if you want the painting to be more good than bad, you're going to come up with a couple different methods or techniques. And in fact, it's very likely that I will, in fact, come up with a third trick or method or technique for rendering all those mullions. Scratching with an X-Acto knife, probably painting with opaque gouache, which of course is not permissible to those who are doing traditional watercolors. And I will probably do some negative or reverse painting. That is, instead of painting the white mullion, I will paint the dark between them. But I'm just about at a point now where I'm going to leave off this broadcast. You're seeing enough. The foliage, let me show you the photograph again. And look for instance at the dark side of this particular bush. Look how dark that corner is. And look underneath these bushes. Look, it's almost black, almost black. And look there's nothing on my painting at the moment that anywhere gets close to that level of darkness. So this goes under, again, line, shape, color, design, value. And by the way, the elements of design that I have been reciting to you, line, shape, color, design, value, texture, line, shape, color, design, value, texture, line, shape, color, design, value, texture, are not in order of, they're not in any order whatsoever. They're only in a poetic order. They flow off your tongue that way. But texture, value is probably the most important element of design. And if anybody's ever taken a good high school or college art course, at some point, I'm doing some of the darkness here just so you can see before we go. At some point, your good teacher said the play of light. That's a very common professorial phrase, and I approve of it very heartily. Play of light is the most important aspect of a representational painting. In fact, it's also a highly important aspect of an abstract painting, but that's getting into a completely another subject, so I'll leave that for today. Play of light is the most important. If you had a good teacher, then you go, yeah, that's right. That's what Miss MacArthur said in 11th grade painting class. Good. And in the elements of design, line, shape, color, design, value is the one that refers to, is synonymous with play of light, value. So here's a again, a kind of a famous, at least famous in my life, a famous art professor quote. And you may, if you've had a good class, you've heard this as well. Color gets the, values do the color, forgive me, values do the work and color gets the credit. Okay? So when a non-artist walks up to your painting and says, oh, look at the color. If they say that, they're probably saying it because, in fact, you have nailed values. People don't recognize the value quite as readily as they do color. So color gets the credit, but the real beauty in your painting is probably the lights and darks, the values. So that's what I'm working on right at this moment with the bushes, right? All right, I have rambled more than long enough. I got anybody? No, just a few chats. How many people watching? 6 watching. Woo! One of whom is me. One of whom is I. Welcome to you 5. If you want to leave a comment before I go, please do so. I am just about to finish up. I hope this looks like fun to you. I mean, visually, not the process. Yes, of course. I hope the process looks fun to you as well. But I certainly hope that the painting is really becoming interesting, or interesting if you're from the right part of the country. It's fun. It's fun to me. I'm happy to report that it's fun to me. I'm trying to think anything. Well, yeah. Let me do one more thing. One more thing before I go, and that is this fire engine red door. Clearly, in the interest of similitude, I have no choice but to make this door bright red. And of course, I'm more than happy to oblige. Because that certainly gives us a delightful spot of color. All right, if I have my wits about me, I will publish or show the finished version of this, perhaps in my next broadcast. I don't know the way I did. Again, you can, for those of you who weren't here, here is, let's see if I can turn on my other camera. Here is the rendering. So there's a fair amount more texture and detail in the finished rendering than there is. This is a little bit plainer. I do like, somebody could say, well, you should stop right there. Yes. That's a good impulse. I'm glad you feel that way. But no, it'll be even better. It'll be better when I have the mullions. Now, the mullions in this house, by the way, most of them I did not paint. Oh, good. Here, this camera's operating for just a minute. Let me switch to this. The mullions in this house I did not achieve with white or light colored gouache. I, in fact, achieved the whiteness of these mullions by simply painting the dark in between them. So it's a negative painting. I left the mullions light. So every piece of artwork is different, of course, different challenge, different objective. As I look at this right now, and I'm going to have to wait for this to dry, even though I like the lightness of the sun hitting the building, it's not quite the right color. I think if I give my client this, they'll say, well, it doesn't look like the color of our house. And I think that's a fair critique. So after this is dry and things aren't blooming and blossoming anymore, bleeding, I'm going to come back with a very careful, and it'll be careful at that point, a very careful orange to make the color more realistic. I will certainly use some light or white gouache to render the framing, the highlights, especially along the roof. The sky might be all finished. It probably is. Anyway, that's enough. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your company. And I hope to be back real soon. Those of you who missed the live broadcast, do please leave your comments. I love reading your comments when it's all over. And if there's anybody here who hasn't subscribed, what are you doing with your life? Delightful to be with you. Thanks for watching. Talk to you again soon.